being thoughtful about what your ICP is in a particular market, what's going to resonate and how value proposition works in one market versus another market. Enterprise selling, in a way, is a little bit of art, whereas as you get more transactional, it becomes a bit more science. How do you use external data to drive effectiveness of your go-to-market engine? Almost going back old school and going, I'm going to ask someone what they think. I'm going to say, hey, Tara, you're an expert in blah. Tell me, I've got this problem. What should I do? Or you orientate back to brands, or you ask people. So
you listen to podcasts.
Exactly. Attribution is important, but you shouldn't obsess about it. So attribution is important so you know what to do more of.
Welcome back to the B2B Sales Blueprint by Firmable. I'm Tara Salmon, the CRO of Firmable, and I'll be your guest host for today. You're not used to that chair, are you, Paul?
Tell you what, it's a little bit more relaxing sitting in this chair than the hosting chair.
I bet. Well, today what we wanted to do was deep dive into what makes go-to-market or modern go-to-market teams successful, what outbound selling looks like and how that's changed, and where teams need to focus next. So there's no person better, I thought, to speak to about that than Paul. So welcome.
Thank you.
So just quickly on the bio. So Paul is a proven B2B tech and go-to-market leader with deep experience building and scaling systematic growth engines. He served as COO at Aconex ahead of its $1.6 billion acquisition by Oracle, and later as CEO at MessageMedia, which was acquired for $1.7 billion. And I've been fortunate to be on those journeys with you for a very long time. So thanks for having me here to guest host today.
Appreciate it, Taz.
So I guess before we jump in, Paul, I just want to start with, why did you want to create and host a podcast in the first place?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess I've become a bit of a podcast junkie. So that was the first thing. So there's a few things, I guess. I have really been fascinated by how much go-to-market and sales has changed over the last 5 or 10 years. Like it's almost unrecognizable when you and I kind of started on the journey. Well, me a little bit before you. So I guess that's one thing. And then you're in something that's changing really rapidly that I'm deeply passionate about. I'm kind of really curious about it. So then I got pretty obsessive about listening to podcasts, as you know. So I just love hearing stories and insights, and it's rare that you listen to a podcast from particularly from a sales leader or someone who's been on a journey, and they just tell their story. And I thought, you know what, we don't, as a kind of an ANZ kind of go-to-market ecosystem, we don't tell our stories enough. And it's, I think partly in some ways we're not very good about telling stories because there's a sense of we in a way we don't want to big note ourselves, but actually, at Firmable, I get out there and I talk to sales leaders and go-to-market leaders, and it's about sharing experiences and what's working and what hasn't worked. And, it's just rare that you don't learn something. And I was just like, why don't we have somewhere where we can chat? And I just want to talk to people because I find it interesting, and I learn something. So in a way, it's a little bit selfish for me. Like it's part of I love chatting to go-to-market leaders, and I'm like, well, if I love it, maybe other people out there will. So that's not any more complicated than that.
I do appreciate that you've become a bit of a podcast junkie. It's one of the more active channels on Slack, sharing out, listen to this episode or watch this, take notes. So who inspires you most when it comes to podcasts?
Look, there's lots of different ones I listen to. And Tara's going to laugh about this, but I actually really, I think what kind of got me inspired a little bit was just listening to Kyle Norton and the way I just, he's a CRO of owner.com, has some great guests on, does a weekly podcast. And it's just, that's on my weekly must listen to list. And it's just, and he just talks to a whole range of different people about a whole range of different things. Got a real focus on kind of AI and how that's changing sales and go-to-market. And it's just, I just find it's really useful. So, and it's just got a nice style. So that's probably my, that's my go-to guy.
So goals for the podcast in addition to... I
want to be like Kyle.
Yeah, I want to be like Kyle. Or maybe if Kyle listens to the podcast, would that be like a tick of success?
That would be, exactly.
Got it. So at the top of the show, I mentioned some pretty impressive stats. You are arguably one of the most successful yet humble and understated. You wouldn't share those stats yourself, I don't think. But one of the best go-to-market leaders in the country, let's be honest, driven 2 of Australia's best tech exits. What are some of the characteristics you look for in a company that you go, this is going to be big, or I want to be on this journey, or I want to build this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess we've been fortunate as well I kind of look at that both through, like I'm an operator, like I look at it through an operator lens, and then I also look at it through an investor lens as well. And there's a few kind of obvious things when you look at, when you're doing that kind of investor screen, there's some obvious things like, you want to be selling something that is a real pain. Like that's kind of obvious, but something that solves a real problem that's not a nice to have, something that people, care deeply about and is super important to the business. So that's kind of one thing, I think. Then you need to have enough, and sounds a bit silly, but you need to have enough customers to sell to, right? So in an ideal world, you've got lots and lots of people to sell to. And then I think it's so they're kind of the outside in things. And then you go, well, what I really look for is, and this probably informs how I think about go-to-market is, do they have a system that is super scalable? And the system for every business will look a little bit different because they're selling different size deals and there's different inputs and there's different demand channels and, different focus on expansion versus new sales versus, there's a whole heap of things go in there. But looking for businesses that have this really scalable go-to-market engine and a set of operators who know what they're doing. So
yeah. And I guess beyond go-to-market, you've obviously spent a lot of time there, but I think in my time with you, I've seen you run all parts of a business. So go-to-market functions, back office functions, ops, etc. I guess what is it that you're particularly passionate about, or what do you think your superpower is?
Yeah, I think it's a really cool. We talk a lot about sales on this podcast and go-to-market, but go-to-market is it's the whole business in a sense. So it's the experience. You can't separate out the experience that a customer has when they ring for a support query or the experience a customer has when they encounter the product for the first time. So it really is a whole of organization thing. And I think that's a bit of an art, right? Unpacking that and understanding which bits are important is in some ways often more art than science. But I think it's that how you build that go-to-market system. I think that's the kind of, as I was talking about before, that's the thing that, I really, really love thinking about.
Got it. And thinking a bit back to the Aconex days and the system and the motion there, can you just, share what that motion looked like in sales? You took it from 25 mil to 250 mil. Just give us a flavour for that.
Yeah, so when I joined, so Aconex, for those not familiar with it, it's construction tech. So really solve the problem for how you kind of manage and coordinate really large construction projects. So think Panama Canal, massive casinos, infrastructure projects. It was, really, I guess was revolutionary, back then for kind of just helping people manage that. So when I joined Aconex, it was already in, I think, 5 or 6 different countries. Obviously started in Australia, had grown out into Hong Kong and then the Middle East and UK. We sold to projects. So basically you would sell to a project and help them manage and deliver that project. And then you would try and then once you sold to one project, you'd try and sell to the enterprise, the contractor or the developer over multiple projects. So that was the motion. It was enterprise selling in the sense that probably our average deal size was circa kind of 100,000. It was very sales led, which is interesting. It was very much how do we kind of mobilize and train a distributed sales organization. So when I think back to the problems or the things we were thinking a lot about, it's we're in 40 countries. Where do we place the next salesperson? How do we hire that salesperson? How do we onboard them? How do we get them performing consistently? How do we think about ramp times? So the kind of the engine or the system we spent a lot of time thinking about was how do you build this really consistent, effective sales organization that can go out there, talk to project managers, project directors, about Aconex in, literally hundreds and hundreds of different cities around the world. So that was the problem we were trying to solve in a sense.
And just thinking about that distributed sales team, because everybody aspires with their businesses to get global, but the realities of that is quite challenging. So how did you think about that, or what were some of the key learnings for?
There was a lot. And I think some things, there's some journeys you would never do if you knew how hard they would be. So international is really hard. We learn a lot of hard lessons about that. We learn a lot about not taking for granted or being thoughtful about what your ICP is in a particular market, what's going to resonate and how value proposition works in one market versus another market. I think we learn a lot about managing an international organization. Not easy, but it's actually, interestingly, one of the things that I think Australian companies do really well, because they kind of have to, right? Like if you're an Australian tech business, you kind of run out of market in most cases. And I think Australians naturally are international at heart. And there's just so many great examples of Australian kind of B2B tech companies that have been successful on the world stage.
Yeah. So Aconex, you've got this kind of very sales-led enterprise style motion. Yep. You then went to MessageMedia and very similar kind of revenue journey, taking that through to 250 mil or old revenue, something like that. But a very different sales motion, very high velocity, inbound, digital heavy. Can you just talk about the differences between those and how you adapted?
It's So our world at Aconex was quarterly sales, like this classic kind of quarterly sales cycles. I think 70% or 60% closed in the last month. 50% of that closed in the last week, and 25% of that closed in the last day. So last day of the quarter. And that didn't matter whether that was the 31st of December. So it was very traditional. How do you forecast deals? How do you manage deals? How do we make sure we're executing well on deals? Versus MessageMedia, where our average deal size was, $2,500, and we had customers were anything from a $5 a month. So MessageMedia, for those, was a kind of a CPaaS messaging company. So it was, thousands of thousands.
Business text, right?
Yeah, business text messaging, exactly. So we had literally, 50,000 customers globally, very much focused on kind of the SMB kind of horizontal market. So it was average custom size was $2,500 a year. We had some customers who spent $5 a month, and some customers who spent $100,000 a month, and kind of everything in between. That was really interesting because that was a fascinating business in a sense, because it was a great business. It was growing really, it was growing really strongly just through almost organic market kind of growth and demand. And the secret to that business was thinking through, well, how do you start to optimize this? So enterprise selling, in a way, is a little bit of art, whereas as you get more transactional, it becomes a bit more science. Mm-hmm. So how do we think about acquiring customers? How do we think about segments? How do we think about how do we treat different sets of customers differently? How do we think about product expansion? How do we think about product upgrades? How do we think about conversion on the website? So it was a completely different experience. And actually, it's, in some ways, I probably enjoy transactional a little bit more. It certainly makes for an easier end of quarter, that's for sure.
And how do you think those two quite different experiences kind of, inspired Firmable, or has informed kind of how you think about go-to-market differently with Firmable?
Yeah, I think, so I guess two kind of anecdotes really. So one was back in the day, so I've always been obsessed by data, and how you think about using data to help you kind of drive kind of go-to-market effectiveness. So if you think about the thematic of there's all this external data out there, which you really should be using to inform how you think about selling and who you sell to. So back in the Aconex days, I said to Karthik, one of the Firmable co-founders, I said, we should know every single project on the planet that's being built. I'm like, so above certain size, above 50 million. So I said to Karthik, why don't we have a list of every project that's being built on the planet, and then we can go, which ones are we on, which ones are we not on, and then we can almost get a kind of a coverage analysis, and we can use that to go, okay, where do we put more salespeople? How effective are we at capturing the available market? And Karthik kind of laughed at me. He said, well, that's impossible. And then he, in true Karthik fashion, he went away and we figured out how to do it. So we ingested, I guess, project information from 20 different data sources, and we literally built a map of every project on the planet. And that's that was just a little anecdote, and that's and we didn't ever publish that, but that was something that helped us think about how do we focus, drive, think about the effectiveness of the Aconex kind of sales organization. And then MessageMedia, I guess, was really, really different example. And you were in the room, I think, at the time, and we were having this. So we used to get, for context, literally thousands of inbound leads every month. And as CEOs tend to do, they ask the obvious question that they don't know the answer to. They're like, right, I get we've got 1,000 leads, and some of them are worth $5 a month, and some of them are worth, $1,000 a month. Why aren't we spending more time with those ones? And then we're like, well, we don't actually know who they are. So you've got all these leads coming in. And the problem we were trying to solve is, how do you focus on the ones that are going to be most valuable? So then we were like, oh, okay. Well, we thought about, maybe we can get revenue or number of employees. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really help, because you could have, just because you've got 100 people, you're not necessarily going to send any large amount of text messages. You're going to send a large amount of text messages if you're an e-commerce platform, if you've got a large database, if you're a B2C. So then we were like, actually, what we want to know is, are they B2B or B2C? What industry are they serving? And I'm like, but what we'd love to know is the size of their database. And then we thought about it a little bit more. And you know what? If we got social media followers, that's a great proxy for the size of the database. So we literally came up with these 5 or 6 kind of attributes, data dimensions, if you like, which helped us define for us what was the ideal customer. And then because we couldn't source that data, we built a little team in the Philippines. And for every lead that came in, we would kind of fill in these, kind of 6 or 7 different attributes. And that's what literally allowed us to start to tune our sales and marketing engine, both how we kind of focused, where we spent our marketing dollars, where we routed them once they came into us. And it's just another example of, and an obvious one, how do you use external data to drive effectiveness of your go-to-market engine?
Yep. And companies really shouldn't have to do that themselves. They shouldn't have to go away, build separate data teams offshore,
completely.
Source from multiple different sources. So, yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. Paul, you've been in the game for a while. Sorry, I'll be careful what I say here. No, but there's been lots of shifts in just how people do outbound over the time, and probably no bigger changes than what we've seen in the last couple of years with the proliferation of AI and the effectiveness of different approaches has really changed. What have you witnessed, and where do you see things at the moment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the things, as things get easier, they get harder, right? So. I think there's this just explosion of kind of noise. So there was the revolution, or the big kind of wave of outreach tools, outreach being one of them, clearly Outreach, SalesLoft, and this kind of starting to automate sequences and outbound and outreach. And then you could suddenly do that in a way that had never been done before and was incredibly effective. And, you would send 100 sequences and 100 emails, and you get 5, 6, 7 responses, and you're like, oh wow, this is amazing. And it's suddenly being able to do things at scale made a huge difference. And then of course, with the rise of AI and more sequencing, you've seen that 5 or 6% is now 0.5% or 0.05%. If you're lucky, completely. So there's just this incredible amount of noise in kind of out there. So in a sense, it's harder to buy now than it used to be, because there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of confusion out there. So I think one of the things that we've seen is, with all this noise, which has been exacerbated by all the AI kind of outreach, personalization tools, etc., I think people are now almost going back old school and going, I'm going to ask someone what they think. I'm going to say, hey, Tara, you're an expert in blah. Tell me who tell me, I've got this problem. What should I do? Or you orientate back to brands, or you ask people. So
you listen to podcasts.
Exactly. So I think there's this, the more that we automate, actually, interestingly, I think the more it goes back to old school referral, trust, brand, word of mouth. And which then goes, when you think about, okay, well, what's the implication? So that's, okay, I get that. But then what's the implication for me as a B2B sales leader or a go-to-market leader? So what we think a lot about at Firmwell is, okay, so how do we engage in a in a really kind of productive and authentic way with our ecosystem, which is sales leadership, and try and be a natural part of that ecosystem, which then gets them talking about us and referring us. So that's been incredibly effective for us. And, something like 70% of our deals are inbound, people coming looking for us. And that's because, we've got some amazing advocates out there in the community who are talking about us. And so this concept of ecosystem activation, I think, is a really interesting one.
And in this kind of mode where there's, stacks of email, relationships are important. Where do you see kind of outbound calling and like the role of the SDR, fitting in here?
It's really interesting. I think so there's still, I think it varies a little bit by who you're selling to. I think that's one thing. I think and also how easy it is to communicate what you're selling on the phone. So one of the fortunate things so we've been really successful with our outbound SDR team at Verbal, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One is salespeople pick up their phones.
I don't want to miss that deal.
Exactly. So salespeople pick up their phones.
Yeah.
I think another one is it's easier to communicate what we're doing. So I think that makes it easy, and it's a widespread problem. So I think there's a few things there. I think but people still want to chat to people, right? And if done in the right way, when it's relevant and highly targeted, and ideally is trigger based. Hey, Tara, I noticed you're heading to you're sponsoring a conference next month. You're clearly trying to kind of build your network or build your prospects within X industry. We can help you with that. So something that's very tailored, very focused, very relevant, can have great cut through.
Yeah. And I guess different motions work. Like there's no one size fits all, right? Yep. Like as you pointed out, it could depend on your ICP, like selling to salespeople versus doctors or but also different markets have different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
So, be it the US or Australia or even broader APAC, it often gets clumped together as one market, but it's probably, it's a bunch of little markets and nuances there. How do you think about that when you're talking scale, but, local relevance and styles?
Yeah, I think, it's a really good question. And it will be, you should ask me in 12 months' time after we've been in Southeast Asia for a while. But I think, there's certain things, so for instance, the Southeast Asian economies are much more messaging orientated, whereas in Australia, people don't tend to use WhatsApp, for instance. Whereas if you're in Singapore, it's
the norm.
It's the norm. So if it would be quite, it'd be completely, it would be absolutely the right thing to do to just touch base and go, hey, and introduce yourself by WhatsApp, and then kind of just start the engagement that way. Whereas you just wouldn't do that in Australia. So I think a lot of the same, but it's not like you don't call in Southeast Asia as well. So one of the things I was really interested in when I was up there a couple of months ago was just chatting to people and go, yeah, absolutely, outbound BDRs, SDRs is really important, but just the way you do it is slightly different. It's got a bit of a different mix of channels and outreach. So that's probably just thinking through, how that channel mix varies, I think.
Now, Paul, you are one of the most analytical people I know.
I'm sure that was a compliment.
The amount of questions you've asked me about like a data point or like quizzing or like taking over a spreadsheet. Yeah, you are amazing when it comes to a spreadsheet. But on our journey, like there's always been these debates around attribution or sales versus marketing source or trying to even just work out what's working and what's not. And, that can be confusing and rewarding and all the feels at different points.
Yeah.
How do you think about measurement in a modern go-to-market function now?
Yeah, it's a super question. It's probably a whole podcast in itself. Yeah. I think a couple of things, like I think it is right to be obsessed with measurement, and you have to have clarity around what are the key things that we want to do that are going to drive our engine? What are the inputs? What are the inputs that are our engine that we know that we can do consistently and then do more of and kind of grow? So measurement's really important. I think though, there's a bit of you can get too focused on measurement. And one of the conversations that we had the other day was the difference between top of funnel and bottom of funnel. Like people often obsess about bottom of funnel metrics, but actually there's a heap of stuff that marketing does at the top of funnel, which is in some ways hard to measure, but super important. Like you're not going to get, we get great SDR conversion, but that's because we've done a lot of top of funnel stuff as well, right? So there's a real mix of top of funnel and bottom of funnel. And then also it's the age of multi-touch, right? So I think attribution is important, but you shouldn't obsess about it. So attribution is important so you know what to do more of and what to do less of. And sometimes you don't need as much data as you think to know that. You can kind of you can sit down with a team and go, well, what's working and what's not? And yes, you need some data about it. You need to be good, thoughtful about analyzing that, but don't get too hung up on individual attribution because things build on each other. So, which is this whole ecosystem activation thing, I think.
And sometimes you just got to back yourself that you're like, well, you're confident this is working. Let's keep doing it or double down.
Completely. So,
I guess a little bit more of a personal question. Like you've worked at different businesses of all different stages of growth, from startup to scale up to, getting acquired by behemoths and everything in between. Like, what stage do you love the most? Like, what motivates you?
I'm a builder. Like, I like creating something. So I think I really love that scale up phase, to be honest, where it's you've kind of you've got something that's working, you've got a product that's resonating, and so how do we make that big? How do we make that, take that international, make that big? I think that's the phase when you're kind of working with a group of people where you know everyone's name in the company. Like that's kind of, it's a silly thing, but that's kind of important to me. Like once you don't know everyone's name, that feels a bit big to me. So yeah, that's probably the phase I like, I reckon. So.
I remember even when you do get bigger, I still remember you even had an app on your phone at one point before having a global conference. I think this was at MessageMedia, probably 300 people. And you had an app that just tested, you're like, I want to know everybody, regardless of whether they're in Melbourne or not. Like,
I was trying to hold back the tide, I think.
Yeah. Quite possibly. No, but it says a lot about, I think, you as a leader as well. So I just moving into maybe some rapid fire questions. If you could change one thing about how most teams run go-to-market, what would it be?
I think we've always done this pretty naturally, but it's the biggest mistake I think people make is don't think about it holistically. So you've got to don't think about it as sales and marketing. You've got to think about it, and you need a team that thinks about it like that and doesn't, when they walk into the room, they don't think I'm here representing sales or I'm here representing marketing. It's like, all right, how do we grow our business? How do we serve our customers better? How do we acquire more customers? How do we close them more quickly? So they're just this, so it's that thinking about the whole, and also just being really open to experimentation, I think. So
yeah, and I like what you said kind of earlier on in the podcast as well about, go-to-market isn't just the role of like your customer-facing teams, right? It's everybody in the business. You want thinking about it and being on the journey and on board with just a growth mindset.
Yeah, it's just, you just need to be curious, because this is, in every business is different, right? So there's no one model that works. Every business, so you got to find what works for you, right? And you got to try things. And so you want everyone to be curious. You want a salesperson to be maybe, for whatever reason, doing a meeting in a slightly different way and going, oh, well, that was weird. That either worked really well or it didn't work, or you want your marketing team just trying stuff, or you want your customer success. So this kind of curiosity, you want your customer success team going, oh, well, okay, that's really interesting, but if the product did it this way, or what's the problem you're trying to solve here? So that if you could have one thing, it's not the question you asked, but if you could have one thing in an organization, it'd be curiosity. So.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The next thing I was going to ask is what's one tip for what you look for when hiring successful people? Is it that curiosity, or are there other attributes?
Yeah, I think, I was having this conversation, it's actually just as a bit of a tangent. I think it's a really interesting time to be going into go-to-market because the world has changed so much. So you don't need to be a 20-year veteran to be good at it, right? So if I was, 21 again, I'd be so excited to be going into go-to-market because you can master stuff because the world has changed so much. You can master stuff and you can be the master of that. So I think what I love and what I really look for is people who are first principle thinkers, who are kind of, and it goes without saying, first principle thinkers, they're passionate, they've got that kind of growth orientation, they're curious, they're, listening to things, they're learning, they come to you and say, hey, so it's the combination of just that drive, that, I just think now's the time for people like that. And like we're so fortunate at Fernwell to, that's probably the thing that I love most about Fernwell is you look around the room and you go, wow. Like there's some great people here, and they think about stuff and they know stuff that I don't, and every day I get to learn from them, and that's cool.
And I guess even for the 20-year-old veterans, might be a bit self-serving, but like it is an exciting time as well, because even if you've maybe done something the same for a long time, like there's so much opportunity and tools at our disposal and learnings and sharings from people like yourself to kind of just get in and try different things, right?
Yeah, I think there's still room for 20-year-old veterans like you and I do.
What's one bit of advice you wish you had when starting your career in sales?
Ooh, what's one?
What was that? Selling wine? Was that?
Funny story. So what Tara's alluding to there was my first sales job, actually. So I'd been working at Melbourne IT, kind of more on the operations and strategy, kind of product management side. And then I was in the UK and lived in Oxford, and I had 3 months before we were heading back to Australia. And so I ended up working at a wine bar with an Aussie mate. And
good job.
It was a good job.
Yeah.
I was on £5 an hour and I was on commission. So I used to get £1 per bottle that I sold. So I was a commissionable bag carrying sales rep. And it was it was a great experience. And then it's just you're there and anyone can walk into the shop. Which is kind of a bit like Fernwell, actually, in a way. Anyone can kind of walk into the shop and you don't know what their context is or where they're coming from. There was a guy who used to walk in who literally wrote the Encyclopedia of Wine. So who knew, like, amazing guy. And then there would be other people. You'd have a 21-year-old walk in who'd, never tasted a Chardonnay before. So it was, so just being able to meet people where they were, and being able to, being able to, kind of help them in some way or share some insight in a kind of a natural way. I think getting to the point where you are able to handle that and share natural insights, took me a while to get there, but that was, I think, one thing that I learned. So. Well,
speaking of sharing insights, I'm super excited that you are hosting this podcast, Paul. And word on the street is you've got lots of exciting guests on the roadmap. So I look forward to tuning in myself as a listener next time.
Yeah.
And but no, thanks very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Taz.